Did you know that St. Luke's University Health Network, based in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, has been recognized by the U.S. government as the highest performing health system in the United States for quality? You heard right. St. Luke's #1 recognition affirms our status as the top leader among the most respected healthcare providers in the nation, including Houston Methodist and the Mayo Clinic. To state it simply, if you want to receive the best care when you go to a hospital, come to St. Luke's.
Whether it's a movie night or just midday, Skinny Pop is a salty snack that keeps on giving. Made with just 3 simple ingredients for an irresistibly delicious taste and a large serving size that lasts. Deliciously popped, perfectly salted. Skinny Pop, popular for a reason. Shop Skinny Pop now.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone. You know, back in the 1970s, there's a very famous Esquire magazine article by a famous writer entitled Frank Sinatra Had a Cold. It's when Old Blue Eyes, the chairman of the board, gave an interview despite the fact that he had a little cold. Well, I've got a little cold and I'm recovering from it. So if you hear a cough tonight, just recognize the show must go on. You know, in foreign policy, timing, leverage, and national interest must guide the strategy of engagement with rising powers. President Richard Nixon grasped this principle as well as any chief executive during his groundbreaking 1972 opening to China. President Bill Clinton, on the other hand, failed his test when he championed China's entry into the World Trade Organization and the permanent normal trade relations, that's most favored nation trading status. That's what made China the dangerous superpower they are today. President Donald Trump's recent state visit to Beijing revives the Nixonian tradition of pragmatic, interest-driven diplomacy with the foreign policy adversary, engaging from strength while delivering concrete American wins, while actively correcting the structural imbalances and strategic vulnerabilities created by the failures of past policies. You see, when Nixon landed in Beijing, that was February 1972, China was still a desperately poor agrarian society still recovering from the Cultural Revolution. Rural areas largely lacked indoor plumbing, and electricity was minimal, particularly in the rural areas. Rural electricity consumption was only about 10% of national totals in the 1960s and 70s. Its military was massive in manpower, but technologically extremely backwards, with limited projection capability. Their GDP per capita hovered around subsistence levels. Nixon, the consummate anti-communist, pursued classical realpolitik, exploiting the Sino-Soviet split in order to isolate Moscow, ease pressure in Vietnam, and create a triangular balance of power. You see, Nixon needed the help of both the Chinese and the Russians to end the war in Vietnam. The Shanghai Communique was deliberately cautious, acknowledging differences, opposing hegemony in Asia, and committing to gradual normalization and people-to-people contacts without massive technology transfers or one-sided economic concessions. Trade in 1972 stood at a mere $95.9 million. Nixon built a bridge across 22 years of hostility, famously declaring it the week that changed the world. But he did so without arming or enriching a future rival at America's expense. Clinton's policy, on the other hand, marked a sharp and consequential departure from Nixon's success. Convinced that economic liberalization would foster political openness, the Clinton administration granted the most favored nation trading status to China in 2000 and supported China's World Trade Organization ascension in 2001. U.S. officials projected modest trade growth and mutual benefits. Unfortunately, reality proved otherwise. Pre-World Trade Organization, the U.S. goods trade deficit with China was about $83 billion. By 2015, it had ballooned to $367 billion, an annual average increase of over $20 billion a year. Imports from China surged from $102 billion to $483 billion, while U.S. exports grew far more slowly from a much smaller base. Economists estimate this China shock displaced 2.4 to 3.4 million U.S. jobs, with roughly $2.6 million of those jobs lost in manufacturing, devastating communities in electronics, apparel, furniture, and other sectors. China's economy, of course, exploded, 11 times larger by some measures, post-ascension, fueled by foreign investment, technological transfers, and export-led growth. Its military modernization rapidly shifting from coastal defense to blue water ambitions. What Nixon engaged as a weak agrarian power, Clinton's policies helped transform into an economic and military superpower. Now, President Trump's May 2026 visit to China reflects a return to the Nixonian calculus adapted by 21st century realities. Direct personal engagement, tangible reciprocal deals, and firm guardrails on strategic competition. Like Nixon's trip, it featured high-level meetings, cultural exchanges, and a warm rapport with leadership. Xi Jinping may be a wicked guy, just like Mao Zedong clearly was, but those characterizations are often immaterial pertaining to geopolitical realities. Unlike Clinton's broad market opening that disproportionately benefited China, President Trump secured very specific wins for American exporters. China committed to an initial 200 Boeing aircraft purchase, with potential expansion to 750 planes, plus hundreds of GE jet engines, reopening a critical market for U.S. aviation and supporting thousands of American manufacturing jobs. Agricultural agreements promised double-digit billions in annual purchases of U.S. soybeans, beef, pork, and other farm programs. Expanded imports of American oil and natural gas further bolster U.S. energy producers. New bilateral mechanisms, including a U.S.-China Board of Trade under a reciprocal framework, aim to stabilize ties on a much more balanced basis. These outcomes contrast sharply with the post-Clinton imbalances. President Trump negotiates from strength, leveraging tariffs, export controls, and alliances, while delivering immediate benefits to U.S. farmers, manufacturers, and energy workers. The approach wisely manages competition without repeating that naive bet that economic integration alone would somehow moderate Beijing's behavior. Nixon engaged in a fragmented, impoverished China to encounter the Soviets. President Trump is engaging a powerful China to prevent dominance in key sectors, secure supply chain resilience, and protect critical infrastructure and technology. Trump has scored with a commitment from China not to provide weapons to Iran, and China will not support Iran's development of a nuclear weapon, at the same time getting commitments for the purchase of American agricultural products like soybean, beef, and pork. Big difference. The Chinese have also agreed to purchase 200 Boeing aircraft, as I say. Trump deals from strength and has cut China's access to cheap oil from Venezuela and Iran. That's why he had the whip hand going into these negotiations. History underscores the difference in risk. Engaging a weak China in 1972 carried manageable downsides, but empowering it through unconditional access after 2000 gave a burgeoning rival everything it needed to obtain global hegemony. President Trump's bridge building seeks to restore reciprocity and leverage, honoring Nixon's realism while repairing decades of policy missteps. The test ahead is whether sustained pressure and a targeted engagement can produce a stable, interest-based relationship that prioritizes American workers' security and prosperity, outcomes put on the back burner due to the neoliberal Clinton consensus. In an era of competing world powers, Nixon's prudence, without wearing ideological rose-colored glasses, offers the wiser path forward. And President Donald Trump recognizes it, coming back with solid wins. Meanwhile, the strength of the Trump endorsement is proven yet again. Senator Bill Cassidy, Dr. Bill Cassidy's political career came to an abrupt halt in Saturday's Republican Louisiana primary. They rejected the U.S. Senate incumbent, pushing him into a third-place finish in the state's Republican primary. He actually got less than 25%, which is the low water mark of all time for an incumbent senator running for re-election within the Republican Party. Republican-endorsed Congresswoman Julia Letlow led the field with about 45% of the vote, while State Treasurer John Fleming faced second with 28%. Both of them, by the way, solid Trump supporters. The two will now advance to a June 27th runoff, leaving Cassidy on the outside looking in. Senator Cassidy's collapse was years in the making. He angered the Republican base by actually voting to convict President Trump after January 6th, repeatedly backing the bankrupt and failing Obamacare program, and candidly whoring himself out to the corrupt healthcare industry. Cassidy, unsurprisingly, also had deep ties to Big Pharma, including taking over $1.2 million in career contributions from the pharmaceutical and health products sector. Cassidy's opponents pointed to donations from major pharma executives after Cassidy became the top Republican on the Senate Health Committee in 2023, as well as his opposition to drug pricing reforms that would have helped working families. Cassidy's defeat marks the first time since 2021 that a sitting U.S. Senator has lost a regularly scheduled primary. That was when Indiana's Dick Lugar was beaten by Richard Murdoch. Letlow now enters the runoff as the Trump-aligned frontrunner. She has campaigned on border security, American energy, and fighting woke policies. She will be a reliable vote for President Trump in the U.S. Senate, and the message will be sent to every other rhino that they need to vote consistently with the America First line. Now, I've been in American politics for over 50 years. I can tell you President Ronald Reagan was extraordinarily popular, perhaps one of the most popular presidents in my lifetime, but his endorsement never packed the kind of wallop that Donald Trump's endorsement does. He has, as he's proud to say, a 95% win rate in those races where he has endorsed a candidate. And that certainly continued in Louisiana. Woe be it to those U.S. senators or congressmen who oppose the Trump agenda, because you may very well be next. Incumbents don't lose. 98% of incumbents win re-election. Senator Cassidy is that rare exception, and that's because he fooled around and found out. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to The Stone Zone, and we'll be right back with more politics.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone. Well, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche has announced that the Justice Department is actively investigating evidence that the 2020 presidential election was rigged. And he's promising the American people will be seeing the results of this investigation very soon. Appearing on Fox News' Sunday morning Futures show, Blanche was asked by Maria Bartiromo about President Trump's long-standing claim that the 2020 election was stolen, and about White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles' suggestion that Americans may learn President Trump actually won certain states. Blanche responded that there is a ton of evidence the election was rigged, saying that the issue has been discussed for years. He said the Justice Department has multiple investigations underway, including in Arizona, Georgia, and specifically Fulton County, Georgia. According to Blanche, investigators are examining whether the right people voted, whether eligible voters were cast, and whether each vote cast only one vote. Blanche acknowledged that the process is difficult, saying that those involved are very good at hiding misconduct. It's not the first time I've heard this. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, once told me that those who may have been involved in election fraud were very careful to erase the evidence. Blanche said uncovering what happened in 2020 requires serious law enforcement work, prosecutors, and old-fashioned police investigation. He also said Americans will be told what the Department of Justice uncovers, whether that comes through charges, a report, or other investigative findings. To me, this is long overdue. The idea that 81 million people voted for Joe Biden, who was basically campaigning from his basement, defies all reality. The idea that Joe Biden, on average, got 20% more in the African American dominated precincts in the urban areas of America, 20% more than Barack Obama, is just not credible. Those who were on the ground in places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Michigan watched grotesque fraud happen right before their very eyes, and in the aftermath they were mocked, censored, smeared for telling the truth about what happened. In some places, for example, with former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, they were disbarred just for zealously defending President Donald Trump and his legal claims. Those who fought back against this massive election fraud faced repercussions, including the Trump electors getting charged with multiple felonies for refusing to go along with the sham. Just to be very clear, having an alternative elector is not illegal. John F. Kennedy, filed an alternative elector slate in Hawaii because on election night it appeared that Vice President Richard Nixon had carried the state, but the Kennedy forces were confident that once all the absentee ballots were counted, that Kennedy would have carried Hawaii. Therefore, he filed an alternative elector slate. They were ultimately seated, and therefore there was no legal action against them. The formation of an alternative elector slate, pending the outcome of litigation over the outcome of the election, is not in any way illegal. If you actually read the minutes of the meeting of the alternative electors in Georgia, they make it very clear that they were forming this slate of electors to protect their legal rights in the event that they were successful in their legal challenge to the outcome of the election. Somehow the folks over at MSNBC and the Biden Justice Department made this a crime when it's not a crime. Kudos to Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche for digging into this, also to Tulsi Gabbard, who's been working on it for some time. We need to know two things. We need to know whether these electronic voting machines are secure or whether they can be manipulated. We need to know whether they have been manipulated. We also need to know about the efficacy of these mail-in ballots. I think the president's right. It's time to have the election on one day, all paper ballots, absentee ballots only allowed on the basis of a legitimate excuse such as health or business absence. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone, and we'll be right back with more political news on the other side.
Adobe Firefly is the all-in-one creative studio with AI-powered image and video editing for today's creative process. Built for creators of every kind, Firefly helps you generate, edit, and experiment fast. Because the asks aren't getting smaller, the budgets aren't getting bigger, and the timelines, oh yeah, still tight. With all the best creative AI models in one place, Firefly brings your ideas to life. Unlock a better way to make with Adobe Firefly.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone. Here's some good news. President Trump is dropping a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS, a move tied to a broader effort to compensate those Americans who were unfairly targeted by federal agencies under previous administrations. President Trump had sued the IRS and the Treasury Department in January, along with Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, alleging that the agency failed to protect their confidential tax records during his first presidency. Former IRS contractor Charles Littlejohn was sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaking Trump's tax records, along with records belonging to thousands of others. Court documents filed Monday said Trump is dismissing the case with prejudice, meaning he cannot bring the same claim again. The filing did not describe a settlement, noting that the case is still in its early stages. The move comes as the administration prepares a $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund for people who were victims of politically driven investigations or misconduct. This is certainly good news for my wife and I in the Russian collusion hoax, in which even Robert Mueller finally had to admit, once we got the federal courts to unredact his long hidden report, that I had done nothing wrong. We lost our home. our insurance, our savings, both health and life insurance, our savings. I had to sell my car. I had to sell my prized electric guitar, put myself to college with that. It was a very dark time, without any question. It was not but for the help of thousands of Americans contributing, in my case, to a legal defense fund that I was able to put on any defense at all, although the judge in my case would really allow no defense, and the whole thing was a Soviet-style show trial in the worst sense of the word. This new anti-weaponization fund is for people who are victims of politically driven investigations or misconduct. Of course, Democrats immediately cried foul. The newly announced fund could go to help those who were thrown in prison or had their due process stripped from them over January 6th, or the so-called fake electors whose lives were destroyed, people like Tina Peters, who were in prison for investigating election fraud. I was glad to see that the governor of Colorado finally commuted her sentence. She's in poor health, and her only crime is keeping documentation of election fraud. Also those like myself who were targeted over the Russiagate hoax, and the lawyers who were sanctioned because they took election fraud-related cases. Recent judgments show how the tide is turning. The great General Michael Flynn, one of my greatest friends, perhaps one of the greatest, finest Christian gentlemen I've ever met, and a true geopolitical thinker, received more than $1 million after suing over FBI conduct. And former Trump advisor Carter Page also settled claims tied to his Fourth Amendment rights being violated by the Obama deep state spooks. Now, General Flynn's victory in court is really symbolic. It is a Pyrrhic victory, because I can tell you he lost far more than $1 million. But it is at least an acknowledgement that he was wronged. And I'm glad to see that. It's time for all of the victims of government weaponization to finally get justice, not just me. It's a shame that the individuals responsible are not forced to pay personally, as far as I'm concerned. And it will be the taxpayers who will be footing the bill. Hopefully, those individuals responsible will pay dearly in the end, hopefully in the form of steep prison sentences. Because, you see, a seditious conspiracy to bring down the government is both illegal and unconstitutional. And there's little question at this point that Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden and the National Security Advisor Susan Rice and the Director of National Intelligence General James Clapper and the odious CIA Director John O. Brennan, one of the most pompous jerks I've ever seen. Last week he was bragging about the fact that, quote unquote, there were professionals still in the intelligence agencies who were resisting the efforts by President Trump to investigate exactly what happened and hold those responsible accountable. This guy never knows when to shut up, to be quite honest with you. I really hope this does, as the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, has said, end up in indictments. There is clearly a path. You don't have to go to trial in Washington, D.C. You can go to trial in South Florida. It's one continuing seditious conspiracy. You see, it began in 2016 in an Oval Office meeting chaired by Obama himself, in which they openly discussed the Clinton plan, which was the false narrative that Donald Trump was assisted to the presidency through Russian interference and assistance that never had any basis whatsoever, in fact. They used two completely fraudulent pieces of evidence, the so-called Steele dossier. That was a secret report that claimed that Donald Trump had inappropriate interactions with Russian prostitutes while visiting Moscow as a private citizen. That turned out to be completely contrived. Paid for by Hillary Clinton, by the way, whose campaign actually paid a fine for trying to disguise that expenditure as legal expenses. And the completely fake claim that the Democrat National Committee had been hacked by Russian intelligence. Once again, this was a claim invented by John Brennan, for which there is no evidence whatsoever. Prosecutors in my case asserted this to be a fact over and over again. In fact, one of them, Jonathan Kravis, whose real name is Kravis, claimed in a rare filing, a surreply, that the government had additional evidence that the Russians had hacked the DNC, but that he couldn't show it to the court because it was classified. That is, of course, a lie. There was evidence that information was stolen from the Democrat National Committee. The judge would not let me bring expert testimony nor forensic evidence. I wanted to call Bill Binney, the former CIA counterintelligence IT expert, who could have proved, based on the download times of those documents, that they were stolen by transporting them to a portable drive of some kind and taken out the back door. So it's time for full transparency and accountability. The Democrats, of course, say pardon me, that this is all about revenge and retaliation. No, it's about accountability and justice. Those who violated the law, those who violated the Constitution in their manic efforts to destroy Donald Trump and his family, their efforts to keep him off the ballot, their efforts to break him financially, their efforts to destroy him and imprison him, they really must be exposed. And I think that's going to happen. So I applaud the president in a selfless act. He could have won this lawsuit. He could have pocketed $10 billion. Instead, those people were victimized on January 6th. Those people like Carter Page and George Papadopoulos, Paul Manafort, General Michael Flynn, and others who were victimized by the Russian collusion hoaxsters, they will all be eligible. I'm not sure what my prospects are, but my lawyers are following it very closely, and perhaps we can get some small modicum of what we lost back. In the meanwhile, President Donald Trump's taking a well-earned victory lap after a major climate panel backed away from one of the most extreme doomsday warning scenarios, which has been used for years to justify radical energy policy, essentially meant to stifle economic growth and development. The United Nations-backed Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has announced that it is adjusting its modeling framework, moving away from the high-end RCP 8.5 style projection that envisioned a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. That scenario helped fuel predictions of catastrophic sea level rises, crop failures, melting glaciers, and global disaster. Isn't that what Al Gore's been predicting for years but never happened? President Trump blasted Democrats on his social media, Truth Social, noting that the climate establishment finally admitted its projections were completely wrong. Many years after the public had already figured that out, President Trump argued that climate alarmism has been used to scare Americans, attack reliable energy, and funnel billions of dollars into these politically driven research and green subsidies. Scientists now say the most extreme forecasts have become less plausible due to renewable energy trends, climate policy, and recent emissions data. Instead, researchers are calling for a broader range of scenarios rather than relying on the most frightening assumptions. So in other words, they are defaulting to what the skeptics have been saying from the very beginning. Americans were told for years that catastrophe was unavoidable unless they accepted higher energy prices, government mandates, and the so-called Green New Deal agenda. Anyone who did not believe this was considered to be a Neanderthal at best, or an evil villain monster at worst. Now even the climate establishment is wisely making energy independence central to their failures. Now even, President Trump has wisely made energy independence central to his agenda, rolling back the Biden and Obama-era restrictions, defending oil, gas, and American workers. Nobody is doubting that the climate change and the planet warms and cools. We have climate change. It's called 4 times a year, summer, winter, fall, etc. But acting like it's our duty to change the weather is the height of liberal hubris. We can't play God. The sooner we accept that, the less likely man-made catastrophe will occur. Meanwhile, Cuba's communist regime is accusing the United States of building a fraudulent case for economic war and possible military action after reports accurately claimed that Havana had obtained more than 300 military drones and was discussing using them against the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez blasted the report, saying that Washington was using media leaks to justify aggression. However, you notice he didn't directly deny that Cuba possesses these drones. The Trump State Department responded very sharply, calling Cuba a failed communist state that has long hosted hostile military, intelligence, and terror groups. Officials say that President Trump will protect America's and U.S. interests and the homeland from any threat. Cuba's rhetoric comes as the regime faces a deepening internal crisis. Its energy minister recently admitted that the country's run out of diesel and heavy fuel oil, leaving the power grid in critical condition. Cuba has not received regular oil supplies since December, relying recently on a shipment from Russia. In other words, no more oil from Venezuela, no more oil from Iran. The United States has also renewed an offer to provide direct humanitarian aid to the Cuban people, aid that would have to bypass regime control by working through the Catholic Church. The Cuban government has resisted these efforts because they don't want the generosity of the United States to be seen. They want to keep demonizing America as part of their continuous communist propaganda drive. Washington says the Cuban regime must choose. They can either play ball or they can face the Venezuela treatment. Join the free world or get Maduro. Those are the options. However, this socialist failed regime may be so stubborn that they choose the hard route. Well, so be it. President Trump is right to treat hostile regimes in America's backyard as national security threats. The Donroe Doctrine is nothing to fool around with. I say the time to liberate Cuba is now. For many, many years, there has been a cottage industry of those in Miami who have got millions of dollars from USAID and collected millions of dollars of campaign contributions complaining about the brutal regime in Havana. Now, finally, President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio may be prepared to bring liberty back to Cuba. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone right here on the Red Apple Audio Networks. And don't go away because we'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone. Delighted to be back with you after a little bout of laryngitis, which is an occupational hazard for a talk show host. A key figure in Minnesota's massive pandemic-era fraud scandal is now raising questions about what Congresswoman Ilhan Omar knew and when she knew it. Amy Bach, founder of the nonprofit Feeding Our Future, was convicted in March of 2025 on conspiracy, bribery, and wire fraud charges tied to an alleged $250 million scheme involving federal child nutrition programs. Prosecutors said that participants submitted fake or inflated claims for meals supposedly served to low-income children, collecting millions in taxpayers' dollars for meals that never really existed. Speaking with the New York Post while awaiting sentencing, Bach said she struggles to believe that Omar did not know about the fraud. Bach denies knowingly participating in criminal conduct and says she tried to warn state officials. Scandal has already led to dozens of convictions and has placed new scrutiny on Minnesota's pandemic-era oversight failures. Omar played a key role in expanding the meal program flexibility during COVID-19 through her 2020 Meals Act, which was pushed broader USDA waiver authority as Washington rushed to loosen rules in the name of emergency relief. Those waivers reduced oversight requirements, and they helped create the environment that allowed fraudsters to exploit U.S. taxpayers on a massive scale. Bach also claimed that when waivers were set to expire, Omar herself would eventually step in to keep the system moving. Ilhan Omar has not been charged in the case, but Bach's comments indicate the obvious. Ilhan Omar is another Somali swindler who's hooking up with their fellow ethnic invaders throughout Minnesota with her crooked behavior in Congress. COVID emergency powers opened the door to reckless spending, weak oversight, and massive abuse, and the invaders took full advantage of that. Now is the time for them to be held accountable and sent back home where they belong. But Omar can stay only if she's locked behind bars, as far as I'm concerned, made an example of what happens when foreigners abuse the generosity and charity of good, decent Americans. To me, there is a fundamental question here. There is no question, has been established, that Ilhan Omar fraudulently married her own cousin in order to gain entry into the United States. On that basis alone, she should be deported. And to this day, I do not understand why she has not been deported. Anyway, Let's move on. A new Rasmussen poll shows that most Americans understand that federal officials under the guidance of America's own Dr. Mengele, Dr. Anthony Fauci, covered up China's role in the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to a new poll, 63% of likely U.S. voters say it is likely that some American officials were involved in concealing China's role from the very outbreak. 43% said the cover-up is very likely. Only 25% said they didn't believe that there was any cover-up, while 13% were unsure. The poll asks a direct question: how likely is it that some U.S. officials were involved in a cover-up of China's role in the COVID-19 pandemic? The poll shows that public distrust remains deep despite years of mainstream media propaganda about the safety and the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccinations. The numbers show that lockdowns, mandates, censorship, school closures, and official attacks on anyone questioning the approved narrative have not changed public attitudes. Public hasn't forgotten about the way their public health officials lied and deceived them. The survey also found that a plurality of voters, 43%, do not believe that Dr. Anthony Fauci has told the truth about U.S. government funding of the gain-of-function research. 36% say they believe Fauci was truthful, while 21% are unsure. This is exactly why accountability matters. Unfortunately, the U.S. Justice Department let the time frame under which Fauci had to be charged for lying under oath to Congress, the very charge that I was falsely accused of, expire. I'm not sure that you could convict him on the larger crime of crimes against humanity, but on the narrow claim that he did not know that the gain of functions at the Wuhan lab were paid for by U.S. taxpayers is a fairly easy case to prove. This is exactly why accountability matters. Americans were told to obey, told to stay quiet, trust the experts, and dismiss the lab leak theory as some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. People who came out day one and cried foul were attacked mercilessly while the cover-up was initiated. Now, many voters, many Americans understand the cover-up, as many in our government were compelled to protect our foreign adversary. This, in my view, is treason. It's clear that many were guilty. It's time to bring them up on charges. We can't wait any longer for justice, particularly justice for the Mengele of our times, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Thanks for joining us today on the Stone Zone. I'm Roger Stone. Until tomorrow, God bless you and Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to The Stone Zone with Roger Stone. You can hear The Stone Zone with Roger Stone weeknights at 8 on 77 WABC. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?